This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history.
We are all grieving, knowing that it could have been our loved ones, it could have been us.
Safety is our expectation. Everyone who flies in American skies expects that we fly safely.
It's one thing for internet pundits to spew off conspiracy theories. It's another for the President of the United States to throw out idle speculation as bodies are still being recovered.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, based on what we currently know, it simply doesn't make sense. The technology was there. The communication appears to have been there. And yet, last night, about 9 o'clock, a passenger jet on final approach to Reagan National Airport and a military helicopter collided. 64 passengers aboard that commercial airliner and 3 members of that Army Black Hawk helicopter crew perished and are presumed dead. There is a recovery effort going on in the Potomac. We have video of the moment of that impact captured. You may see it momentarily. That recovery effort, those stills you see on the screen right now, is ongoing in the Potomac River. That is dangerous, hard work. The water is not icy, but it is still very cold. And an investigation has commenced, civilian and military, to find out exactly what happened and quite possibly propose future remedies. Earlier today, President Trump addressed this tragedy and later, at his own acknowledgement, offered without any evidence suggestions that past administrations' diversity, equity, and inclusion programs might have somehow been to blame.
As one nation, we grieve for every precious soul that has been taken from us, but we'll find out how this disaster occurred and we'll ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. My administration will set the highest possible bar for aviation safety. We have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. It matters intellect, talent.
The business of government continued on Capitol Hill. 3 Trump administration picks participated in confirmation hearings. Kash Patel is FBI director. Tulsi Gabbard is the head of National Intelligence, and Health and Human Services Secretary nominee Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We will get to those confirmation proceedings later in the show. We will start now with Skylar Henry, who comes to us from Reagan National Airport. Skylar?
Major, good evening to you. Well, to summarize, the NTSB has indicated that their investigation will be 3 things: thorough, steady, and meticulous. They say that this is the first full day that they are able to get a full grasp on exactly what happened last night, saying that crews are still in the recovery process trying to get as many bodies as possible. Clearly, they have been working for hours in this process, in this investigation, but they say that they are trying to do as much as they can, especially before nightfall, where they will continue to then work to try to figure out exactly what happened here. Remember, there is still wreckage here as well, that because of the Potomac is moving down the river as well. We've seen some closures at some of the ports along the area as well, as crews look to do their work. After hearing from the NTSB, they also said that there will be several groups in charge of this investigation, everything from structure groups looking to figure out impact angles and pre-impact courses and what the altitude of both those aircraft would exactly be. There will also be a systems group looking at air traffic control systems, reviewing the radar, and also looking about the communications that happened between air traffic control and the pilots on board those aircraft. And also they said that they will be looking at human performance as well. That will assess exactly what was going on, who said what, how they will do everything that they need to in order to get to the bottom of this investigation. They said that they have yet to find the flight data recorder. The NTSB chair indicated that that is still underwater. They have also yet to recover the so-called black boxes on either of those aircraft as well. Now, one thing that we should point out, that earlier today in that White House press briefing, we heard from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who indicated that a mistake was made last night. Take a listen to this sound. Based off of you all's initial investigations and preliminary findings, have you all been able to tell whether this was human error or mechanical failure?
The question was, is there been human error or mechanical failure? We don't know what we know just yet. We do not know enough facts to be able to rule in or out human factor, mechanical factors. That is part of the NTSB investigative process.
Now, the NTSB has indicated that they expect at least their preliminary findings to come out within the next 30 days. Something else we should point out, Major, is that they say that they are still very much in the briefing families portion of this process, as well as families are still making their way to Washington, D.C. and Reagan National Airport, some of whom have yet to be notified of the fact that their loved ones were on board these aircraft as well. They say that they are looking to support them as much as possible. There is contact information available, therapy hotlines, all sorts of measures to try to wrap their arms around these families who are going through so much in this trying time as this investigation is in its early stages.
Skylar Henry at Reagan National Airport, thank you. Eleanor Watson now joins us from the Pentagon. Ellie, what can you tell us about what the military is saying about this mission, the flight of the helicopter, and the experience level and the routine or non-routine nature of the flight itself?
Yeah, Major, what we're learning, first of all, is that one of the bodies has been recovered. The two other bodies, the body of the pilot and the co-pilot, are still trapped in the helicopter in the Potomac. Recovery operations are underway. Those 3 soldiers were on an Army Black Hawk when it collided last night with the passenger plane. This Black Hawk was on a routine training flight. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that it was an annual evaluation of a nighttime flight. Now, what is so concerning about what happened last night is that we regularly see military helicopters on the Potomac. They're flying nightly, daily. The route that this helicopter was on last night was described as a fairly easy corridor, and Army officials have said that the crew on board that Black Hawk was a very experienced crew. One pilot had 1,000 flight hours. The other pilot had 500 flight hours. So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says the Army is looking into this, that this was pretty much routine, but tragically a mistake happened last night.
And Ellie, was anything mentioned either by the Secretary or other officials at the Pentagon about suspending similar helicopter flights in the aftermath of this, pending some sort of review, or are they going to continue to go on?
So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that the battalion that this particular Black Hawk came from, the 12th Aviation Battalion out of Fort Belvoir, Virginia, will be on a 48-hour pause as this investigation gets going. And the Army will certainly look at other potential safety briefings that they can give about this incident as we learn more. I do want to note, I reached out to the Army equivalent of the NTSB that we've been hearing from all day. The Army equivalent gave us some stats about aviation mishaps, they call mishaps, over the past few years. And what is concerning is that fiscal year 2024, so last year, was the highest number of aircraft incidents with fatalities since 2014. So over a 10-year period, last year was the second highest. I mention that not because not every incident was a Black Hawk, but I mention it to bring up what the Army is concerned about with their safety and training.
Eleanor Watson at the Pentagon, thank you very much. Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen joins us now. Senator, it's good to see you. This is a tragedy for the nation, but it is acutely one for the District of Columbia, Virginia, and Maryland. You represent Maryland in the Senate. First thing I want to ask you is, we have confirmed earlier in New York Times reporting that in the control tower last evening, one control tower person was tasked with monitoring the movement of helicopters and commercial aviation. Is that concerning to you?
Well, Major, it's good to be with you. I've seen those reports, and there is a situation about the staffing levels, not just at Reagan National, but FAA staffing levels around the country. So clearly that will be an issue that the NTSB has to look into.
What are you most curious about as you evaluate what you have been told by aviation officials, what you have learned independently, and what your constituents are no doubt seeing in newspaper accounts and on social media? What is most on your mind?
Well, first, as you said, this has got a big local impact. There are people from around the country who've been killed in this crash, including Marylanders, and our hearts go out to everybody who lost loved ones. People, of course, have questions. Something clearly went wrong, right? This was an avoidable accident. I do think it's important not to jump to conclusions before the NTSB does its work. And they're beginning to do that, as you say. You reported they haven't recovered yet the recorders. They haven't recovered the flight data. But they need to be very transparent about their work and move just as fast as possible to maintain public confidence.
I'm sure you're aware, Senator, of what President Trump said after offering consoling words for the country. He, as was put to questions later, acknowledged he had no evidence, but nevertheless suggested that somehow federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs might have been to blame for this. Your reaction?
Major, I actually was watching that news conference, and I was absolutely appalled that the President of the United States would make these reckless, unsubstantiated claims in the middle of this national tragedy, to politicize this national tragedy. And I think he owes an apology to every family who lost loved ones on that airplane. I think he owes an apology to the country, because he admitted, as you said, he had no basis for making these claims. And he was in the room with the head of the NTSB that's supposed to be conducting an independent investigation, and yet making these reckless, grotesque claims. I was just appalled that the president would use the moment for political purposes.
Let's talk about Reagan National. As I understand it, it had a theoretical capacity of 15 million flights a year. The current capacity is about 20 million flights. Again, as I understand it, I may have those numbers wrong. Feel free to correct me. Is it running at a higher capacity than you believe is recommended? What is your level of concern about what those associated with Reagan National have to do to achieve maximum safety?
So with respect to this particular collision, we obviously have to await the facts, but I have had an ongoing concern about the congestion at Reagan National Airport. In fact, just last year, Senators Kaine and Warner from Virginia and myself opposed the plan to bring more flights into Reagan National, because it is already the most congested airport in the country. Right now, the amount of time planes have to spend hovering over Reagan National before landing is the longest wait time in the country. So beyond this particular collision, I do have a concern about the safety issues regarding the congestion, and that's why we opposed the idea of bringing even more flights and more planes into this very congested airspace.
Very quickly, Senator, do you think that decision to bring more planes in will be now revisited?
I think that we need to take another look at all these safety issues. You know, whether or not that's the cause of this particular collision, that's up to the NTSB. But hopefully this will remind everybody that our number one priority has to be the safety of the flying public, and we should look at everything in the context of this terrible tragedy.
Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Question, how could this have happened? Even with high-tech safety measures in place and lots of other communication and experience. Former chair of the National Transportation Safety Board and CBS contributor Robert Zumwalt will help us try to understand and get to some of those answers, if at all possible. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The National Transportation Safety Board has launched its investigation into this tragedy.
We are all here because this is an all-hands on-deck event. And we're here to assure the American people that we are going to leave no stone unturned in this investigation. We are going to conduct a thorough investigation of this entire tragedy, looking at the facts.
CBS News transportation safety expert and analyst Robert Zumwalt joins us now. He's former chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. Robert, it's always great to have you with us under terrible circumstances. That's sort of how this goes. You're with us when terrible things happen, and this is undoubtedly a national tragedy. Based on what you've seen, and I know there are plenty of armchair speculators on social media, separate them entirely. Based on what you've seen, what you have heard, how would you evaluate what we can glean from the information currently available?
Major, thank you. You know, I came from the NTSB, and I'm not going to speculate. There's a lot of information out there. Some is true and some is not. I think it's important to just slow down, take a breath, let the NTSB do their jobs, let them collect the information, and then disseminate it in a reasonable manner.
Is it unnatural for people to say, wait a minute, this is the nation's capital. It is a heavily trafficked airport. This is a corridor where military helicopters fly routinely. There's technology, there's communication. How could this happen? Is that a natural or unnatural question to ask?
Well, it's certainly a natural question, and it's one that we're all asking. How could something like this happen? And the NTSB will get to the bottom of it, and then ultimately they will come out with recommendations to keep something like this from happening again.
It has been said by others who have done the work that you do, Robert, that there is almost never only one cause of an aviation disaster. It is typically a series of events. First of all, is that true? And do you have any sense of what series of events might have been, if not to blame, implicated?
Well, you're right. I've investigated or been involved in the investigation of over 200 transportation accidents. And I do generally find that there is more than one factor involved in the accident. I think there's a couple of things that will be really under the microscope here. One will be, how did the lateral spacing of the regional jet and the helicopter, how did that get so tight that it was just a matter of feet that they were separated by? I'm curious about that, and I know the NTSB will dig into that.
What about our reporting, and others have reported similarly, that in the control tower there was one air traffic controller monitoring the movement of helicopters and civilian aircraft simultaneously, an obligation typically undertaken by two in the control tower?
Well, Major, I've not independently verified that, but if that's the case, I would be very concerned. The very first aviation disaster I went to as I was a brand new NTSB board member was in fact an accident where we found that there was only one controller on duty when the FAA's guidelines called for two. And we feel like that had that control tower been properly staffed, that accident may not have occurred. And so I'm a member, or was a member, of an independent safety review team to look at the air traffic control situation. We were appointed by the FAA administrator a few years ago, and we definitely confirmed that there is a controller shortage, and that needs to be resolved. It's not going to be resolved overnight. The FAA is working on it, but we've got to keep working on that.
And Robert, is there a congestion problem at Washington Reagan National Airport, and should that be reevaluated?
Well, I keep hearing that. I was an airline pilot for 24 years. I never thought that DCA was a particularly congested airport. So, it needs to be studied, and we've got to look at it again.
Robert Zumwalt, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
American Airlines Flight 5342 originated Wichita, Kansas. How that community is dealing with this epic tragedy. We'll speak with the city's mayor. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thank you for staying with us. American Airlines Flight 5342 from Wichita, Kansas was on final approach to Washington Reagan National Airport when it collided with a Black Hawk Army helicopter. Wichita Mayor Lily Wu joins us now. Mayor Wu, the nation stands with your city in sorrow and solidarity. Describe to the best of your ability how your community is doing.
We appreciate the thoughts and prayers that this entire community of America and of the world who have been sending us those messages. We really appreciate that. Here in our community, we have faced many challenges. This very flight that we're talking about started exactly a year ago on January 8th when I took office. And I've seen many challenges, but nothing compares to this. And right now, we're simply asking for people to send their prayers to the victims, their families, their friends, all the first responders, and everyone here in our greater Wichita community. I know that this is a reminder to all of us that life is precious and that we need to come together. And here in Wichita, we just held a prayer this afternoon, a community-wide prayer of all faiths coming together to pray again for those families and friends. And here in Wichita, we simply want people to know that we're united as Wichitans, as Kansans, and as Americans.
Mayor Wu, based on what you know of the flight manifest, how has this affected your community personally?
I was at the airport last night and got to meet one of the families whom I do know. And it's been very difficult for the entire council, as in the community of Wichita, of about 400,000 people. We will know not just one or two individuals on that flight, but we just as a community have embraced a lot of the skaters that were here for the U.S. Figure Skating Championship, and they became part of our family last week. And so I know that our entire community is going to be mourning, but we're also going to stand strong for those families, and we are here to comfort them.
Mayor Wu, you mentioned the skating championship. As I understand it, some of those who were aboard this flight stayed a bit longer in Wichita to participate in a camp for younger skaters. Do I have that correct?
I do know that several figure skaters did stay behind after a championship. Many of them have conferences or camps that are held in the host city. And so we do know that there were some figure skaters, coaches, as well as families that did remain after the championship. And we have been in close contact with hearing what U.S. figure skating is saying. And they do say that they have been affected.
I know a bit about the Midwest, Mayor Wu, and when communities like yours get a flight like this to a prominent national airport, it's a point of pride. It's a point of celebration, something it typically takes a while to accomplish. In that framing, what is the future of this flight? What is the sense of confidence you have and you want to share with your community about aviation generally in our country?
Well, Wichita is known as the air capital of the world, and we pride ourselves in our aviation history as well as the industry that continues to thrive here in Wichita. So we were very proud to get that nonstop flight from Wichita to Washington, D.C. I was actually at the airport last year when this flight was inaugurated, and I even took that flight back in March of last year. And again, I have been confident in flying the aircraft that are built by skilled manufacturing individuals here in our great state of Kansas. And I will continue to be supportive of our community as the air capital of the world, as well as our airport director as he continues to give us these opportunities for nonstop flights from Wichita to anywhere around the United States.
Mayor Wu, one last question. This is a time for grief. The next stage will be getting questions asked and answered, but I wonder if you had any opportunity to hear President Trump's remarks today and if you had any particular reaction.
I actually have simply been on the phone locally with individuals here in our community. At noon, we had a community-wide prayer. My main purpose and my main focus are those individuals here in our community that need to find that strength to rally behind the families and friends who have been affected. And so I was focused on our community prayer And I asked again that all individuals come together, provide that comfort to families and friends, and really unite how we have in Wichita as Wichitans, as Kansans, and as Americans.
Wichita Mayor Lily Wu, thank you. While recovery divers were at work on the Potomac River today, President Trump tried to point the finger at a potential cause of this collision. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In his opening remarks in the White House briefing room today, President Trump said the mid-air collision over the Potomac River was a dark night in our nation's history. Moments later, he shifted blame with, as he later acknowledged, no evidence to support it, suggesting the Democrats, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives might somehow be to blame.
We must have only the highest standards for those who work in our aviation system. I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary. And then when I left office and Biden took over, he changed them back to lower than ever before.
Nancy Cordes joins us now from the White House. During that presentation, Nancy, as you know, you were in the front row. President Trump went to great lengths to read from an FAA website. Can you convey to the audience the history of what he was talking about and how long that particular language had actually been on the FAA website?
Sure. He started arguing, Major, that under the Biden administration, the FAA had sent out a directive ordering FAA officials to hire people with severe disabilities. And he started listing out the various nature that these severe disabilities could take. Someone who was an amputee, someone who was severely intellectually disabled, and on and on. I was surprised by this. I actually started looking it up right there in the front row to see if there was anything to this. And it turns out, as reporters who were also doing the same thing I was, actually pointed out to the president in that press conference, this is a directive that has been on the FAA website since 2013. So it also encompassed the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. And in fact, it went beyond the FAA to other government agencies as well, talking about the goal of hiring people with severe disabilities, not necessarily for positions like air traffic controller, but for lower level positions. So it doesn't appear that what he was talking about had anything to do with the Biden administration specifically, which he was blaming, and also didn't have anything to do with the crash because it did not apply to the air traffic controllers who were in the tower, and it certainly didn't apply to the pilots who were flying either the regional jet or the Black Hawk helicopter.
And Nancy, it also creates the implication that whomever was hired by the FAA as an air traffic controller would not have to go through the same rigorous training procedure to become an air traffic controller.
Right. You know, I've been talking to air traffic control representatives, to congressional offices, and other experts all day long to try to figure out what President Trump is talking about when he says that the standards were high during his administration, but lower during Biden and Obama's administrations. And they simply can't point to any evidence that the standards have meaningfully changed. In fact, what they told me is that the standards for air traffic controllers have actually always been quite high, and the training program quite onerous. It lasts for 2 to 4 years. A lot of people end up dropping out. In fact, the challenge typically for years, right up until today, isn't that the standards aren't high enough, but that there are shortages because people who are skilled enough to make it to become an air traffic controller, they can probably make a lot of money in higher paying jobs. And so, you know, they say that the fact that President Trump is somehow pinning this on DEI simply doesn't bear out. And even President Trump acknowledged himself today that he really doesn't know whether the race or gender of the pilots or the air traffic controllers had anything to do with what we saw last night.
This is what journalism is, ladies and gentlemen. Someone says something, we compare it to the facts, and we report both. Nancy Cordes, excellent job, as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I want to turn now to Capitol Hill, where today senators grilled several of President Trump's picks for key cabinet positions, namely FBI Director nominee Kash Patel, Director of National Intelligence nominee Tulsi Gabbard, and Health and Human Services Secretary nominee Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Nicole Killion is following all of this. That is an enormous task, Nicole. I can't possibly hope that you can summarize all three, but I know you will give us your best effort. Tell us, if you can, the highlights of the confirmation proceedings today.
Well, this was by far one of the more contentious days on Capitol Hill as far as some of these confirmation hearings are concerned, simply because each of these nominees faces different questions and controversies of their own, whether we're talking about R.F. Kennedy Jr., whether we are talking about Tulsi Gabbard, or whether we are talking about Kash Patel. All of them are potentially on the ropes in terms of whether or not they will ultimately have the votes to be confirmed. So these hearings today were very critical. With respect to Kash Patel, of course, there were a lot of eyes on that one. In fact, his name came up during Pam Bondi's confirmation hearing for Attorney General many times, but really Democrats and Republicans tried to press him on some of his past statements and views, particularly around January 6th, whether or not the president lost the 2020 election. He did break briefly with President Trump on January 6th, saying he does not support this blanket pardon or clemency for those who committed acts of violence against law enforcement, but for the most part stuck to the script, as did Tulsi Gabbard in her hearing, really trying to say that she would be independent, and really tried to push back against characterizations of her as being, for instance, too sympathetic to Russia or Syria. And then, of course, you had RFK Jr., who was back on the Hill for a second day of hearings. His confirmation hearing really centered once again on his views around vaccines and whether or not they cause autism. He was pressed numerous times by senators like Bernie Sanders and Louisiana Republican Bill Cassidy, who after this hearing said he's really struggling with whether or not he can support Kennedy's nomination. So still unclear what the path forward is for all of these nominees, but at least they've crossed the hurdle of being before lawmakers and in the hot seat, Major.
A tall task to summarize the day, but you did it as adroitly as always. Nicole Killion, thank you so much, coming to us from Capitol Hill. A reporter panel is standing by to weigh in on today's confirmation hearings. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. It's reporter panel time. I want to bring in Khadija Goba and Dan Kleidman. Khadija is politics reporter for Semaphore. Dan is a CBS News investigative reporter. As you both heard, Nicole Killion summarized the day on Capitol Hill. It was busy. Dan, I want to talk to you about your presence and the presence of Kash Patel, the confirmation hearing day to be the next FBI director. What's your takeaway?
Look, I think he got through it reasonably well. I don't think a single Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to oppose him, and I think he's going to get confirmed. To me, I thought the thing that was most striking was how Patel tried to walk this fine line between trying to establish some independence from Trump, which he, I think, needed to do, but also to not cross Trump on the things that he cared most about. So just very quickly,
sure.
He establishes independence by saying that he opposed the commutation of sentences against the January 6th defendants who
were most violent,
who perpetrated violence against law enforcement officers. He didn't really have a choice in some ways, because if he had been confirmed, if he's confirmed as FBI director, he walks into that building, thousands of agents, he's got to have their backs. But he did not explicitly say that Joe Biden had won the election.
What did he say?
He said that Joe Biden was confirmed,
was sworn in,
essentially.
Right. The procedure happened, but
that's right.
Agnostic on whether or not it was legitimate.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
He
could
is
not
a
go
familiar
further than
dodge.
that. That's right.
Khadija, what's your sense of Kash Patel, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Tulsi Gabbard and their prospects for confirmation?
I mean, about a week and a half ago, a colleague of ours at Semaphore suggested that Tulsi Gabbard was going to have the hardest time crossing against the panel or, passing confirmation. So I think, as you suggested, Republicans are in a tight spot. They need to, make sure that they confirm these people. But there are a lot of hang-ups around Tulsi Gabbard, and their whispers grew louder and louder about a week and a half ago about her qualifications and, her relationship with Snowden and certain other controversial figures. So she has been the one that to me, sticks out the most. Obviously, this is a thing where politics and governing kind of like clashes, right? And we have to understand, or, you know, they're grappling with whether or not they have the person that will actually be able to execute government.
Mm-hmm.
So
not just simply satisfy the president who appointed them. Kadia, you've also been reporting on another part of the Trump agenda conversation. Did not occur here in Washington, D.C., occurred at Doral, Trump's golf course just outside of Miami, with House Republicans. What can you tell us?
So, you know, largely, Speaker Johnson wanted to leave Doral with a blueprint. Not sure that that actually happened. And when I say blueprint, I'm talking about reconciliation. This big bill that they're going to throw all this, you know, all the stuff in.
Tax cuts and other policy that they can wedge into there.
And everything. And it's not clear that they accomplished that, but they're under a very strict deadline. Sometime next week, they need to have a resolution if this is going to happen. They are still very divided. There are a few people like Chip Roy that did not make the retreat, and he has said that he is not voting for something that will not cut the deficit. Right. So they're in a tight spot, but time, I think I left the convention or the resort thinking they understand the time restraints, and this is probably the final push that they're going to like get something done next week, but we'll see.
Right, indeed. Dan, I want to ask you if you think the Kash Patel confirmation that you witnessed today is kind of emblematic of some of the tougher confirmation pushes from President Trump, in that the nominees have to essentially reject or throw out some of their previous statements and say, well, that was me then, this is me now, and I'm a different person and I will act differently.
Yeah, he had to distance himself from his own words.
Kash Patel.
Kash Patel. Over
enemies list.
And over enemies list.
Podcast appearances.
Podcast appearances. There was a lot of talk of the J6 prison choir. You know, this was the song that was played over and over again at Trump rallies that exalted the January 6th defendants. He said he didn't even know these people. He said he had nothing to do with the recording of that song. You know, it kind of strained credulity.
There's an association there that is not only political, but in some cases commercial.
Well, that's right. And there was a very dramatic moment in the hearing when Senator Adam Schiff of California said to Patel, you know, I want you to turn around and I want you to look at the Capitol Police who are in this hearing room, look them in the eye, and tell them that what you did was right. And he wouldn't turn around. He looked at Schiff and said, well, I'm going to look at you because you're talking to me. Last thing I'll say about this is, you know, yes, he had to distance himself from the things he said to a certain extent. But I've covered FBI directors, I'm embarrassed to say, since William Webster. Mm-hmm. Yep. You know, the FBI was always a political lightning rod to some extent on the left and the right. At this point, it has become so polarized, so partisan, that, you know, he didn't even have to really adhere to the normal things that people say about the FBI over and over again. Senators were saying it's a corrupt institution, you know.
Republican senators.
Republican senators, completely rotten, you know. And so it's amazing how much Kash Patel could actually stick to what he believes and what he said without really jeopardizing his confirmation.
And in so doing, possibly be confirmed and sounding like no other future FBI director has ever sounded about the Bureau and their intentions. Dan Kleidman, Katia Goba, thank you very much. Good to see you. Next, we'll talk to a former Black Hawk pilot about one of the aircrafts involved in the crash over the Potomac River. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Aviation disasters in this country are exceedingly rare. This one was unique. The collision midair of a commercial aircraft and a military helicopter, not very far from the Pentagon. That means the civilian authorities in our country, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the Pentagon will be collaborating in the investigation to find out how this occurred. To give us some valuable insight into that process, I want to bring in Bradley Bowman. He is the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and importantly for this conversation, a former Black Hawk helicopter pilot. And that was the other of the two aircraft involved in this tragedy. Bradley, it's great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've flown a Black Hawk. Have you flown this particular corridor in the nation's capital?
Yes, many times. I was in the 12th Aviation Battalion for 2 years, and I commanded Charlie Company there, including on the night of 9/11, and I've thrown through that exact airspace many, many times.
What can you tell us about that process and what you believe may be implicated in what has happened?
There's a system of low-level helicopter routes throughout the capital region that goes above a lot of the freeways and along the Potomac, and it is a very normal, routine thing for military helicopters to fly along those routes. As you're flying past Reagan National Airport, you go down to around 200 feet to deconflict that helicopter passage with the aircraft flying in and out of Reagan. It's a system that's been in place for decades, and throughout that time period, it's ensured the safe deconfliction of those helicopters and aircraft flying in and out of Reagan. But last night, that system failed, and I think it's really important to understand why, so something horrible like this never happens again.
That hard deck terminology, 200 feet, how important is that in the safety of this entire complex system of movement of aircraft and helicopter?
Throughout the entire system, there's a prescribed route and a prescribed altitude you're supposed to be at. And that altitude becomes particularly important right there at Reagan National Airport, because as you're flying, you literally have aircraft coming in and out, and you have to stay at that altitude. It's not really a hard deck. It's a don't fly above that as the helicopter, so that you have what we call in aviation deconfliction, just the spacing horizontally and vertically to make sure there's not a midair collision. And for some reason, that failed last night.
Tammy Duckworth, Senator from Illinois, told our Nicole Killian that based on an FAA briefing, air traffic control spoke with the helicopter crew, to her knowledge, twice, and the helicopter crew acknowledged instructions about where to be twice. Does that tell you anything important?
That sounds like the routine protocol. When I would be flying north to south on the Potomac, you'd check in as the helicopter pilot with the tower at Reagan, and you would not proceed past Key Bridge, for those who know, unless you had clearance to do so, or you wouldn't go past Wilson Bridge in the south without clearance to do so.
And there is recording, and it is a limited insight into the air traffic control communication with the helicopter, but it does have an ask and answer process in which the control tower asks, do you see the regional jet?
Yeah.
And there is an affirmation or a confirmation, yes.
Yes.
And yet this catastrophe occurred.
Yes.
Is it possible air traffic control and the crew on the helicopter were talking about a different plane being observed?
That's exactly what I was going to say. If you look at the video closely, there was another aircraft taking off. And so what may have happened, and we're going to need to follow the investigation. This is informed conjecture, respectful of the investigators, of course, and the gravity of the situation, is that the crew would have checked in at Key Bridge. They would have given them permission to proceed, speed up, slow down, hold. They would have proceeded. They say, we have an aircraft taking off, runway, whatever. Do you see it? Go behind that. They would have said, we'll comply. The tower was probably talking about the fixed-wing aircraft that they ultimately collided with. The crew may have seen the other aircraft, been watching the other aircraft, not realizing that the tower was talking about the aircraft they would ultimately collide with. That's possible.
Before I let you go, there's been questions about whether or not this crew would have, under typical circumstances, in a flight of this kind, be wearing night vision goggles? Or would they have been doing something called visual flight rules?
Right. When I was flying this more than 20 years ago, we didn't have night vision goggles, and it was just fine, and it was safe. In this situation, night vision goggles, I think, would almost be unhelpful because it reduces your field of view and your peripheral vision. And over a city with lots of lights, that's too much light for night vision goggles. So that will be a key investigation. Were they wearing NVGs, and how did that impact what happened?
Powerful insight. Bradley Bowman, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it very much. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.